Thank you. And, before we start, let me also say that we have some of the young Foreign Service officers joining us with me today here in the embassy, but also on the video conference. May I first request Mr. Vijay Dhar to say a few words to sort of start off this meeting. Then I will request Ambassador Ronan Sen to speak. Shri Vijay Dhar, please.
Firstly, thank you so much. I'm really emotionally touched that DP Dhar Memorial Hall has been refurbished on his death anniversary, which was on the 12th of June. And to you, Ambassador Venkatesh, I express gratitude from my family and me. And I have, old friends who've been associated with my father and who have from time to time given me various stories about him, including Sati Lamba, who got married because of my father. But that's another tale. But however, I'm very, very touched deeply and emotionally. And I would like now Ronan to start with whatever he has to say first.
Thank you, Kumar. Sorry, Vijay, to everyone else.
Yes, sir. So please go ahead.
Yeah. When I saw the little clip, first thing which reminded me was, when I first walked through those gates one fine summer day in '68, those gates were never locked. And throughout Mr. Ambassador DP Dhar's time, they were never locked, like his house doors were also always open. But so as a young officer, green behind the ears, as they say, it was a very special privilege for me, both in professional terms and in personal terms, to serve with Ambassador DP Dhar as a special assistant, and also particularly to have a ringside view at that time, and also contribute in a very modest logistical manner to various momentous developments which took place during his tenure, culminating above all in the signing of the Indo-Soviet Treaty, which was after he left, but he remained absolutely involved. In fact, I remember his visit just before the treaty was signed in August to tie it up, finalize the draft and all arrangements. So, and this also, in his efforts, which he coordinated again throughout, to also mobilize what was the biggest sort of, you might say, airlift of spares and armaments to get us ready for those Bangladesh operations at that time, for our armed forces to be ready. And also in the diplomatic preparation, because this was, in a way, our finest hour at the Bangladesh liberation, not just in military terms, but in diplomatic intelligence, public relations, and various other ways. It was a masterfully choreographed operation. And in this, there were a number of players. I had the occasion at that time to get acquainted with most of them. But I would say without any hesitation that you can say that the one architect, or the main architect, there are many architects, main architect was at that time Ambassador DP Dhar, both in his capacity as ambassador and later on as chairman of the Policy Planning Committee. Now, these all have most of them, I think virtually all of them, but not exclusively. I think there are some aspects which are still classified, but they have been chronicled in detail, including but not exclusively in the embassy papers, the papers which are available there. but elsewhere. And so I will not dwell on these at length, but if you permit me, what I will do is I'll give you some my personal impressions of DP Dhar as a person, as a man, as a human being. And he was really a wonderful human being, and as I got to know him. He ran the embassy as a very tight and well-knit team, uh, almost like a large family. In fact, it was a family. And there was no discrimination between officers, whether they're in the Foreign Service or the IAS or the IPS, the armed forces. We had a very large contingent of embassy attaches, as well as visiting uh, officers. There were hundreds of them spread all over, including in close cities like Vladivostok at that time or elsewhere. Also PSUs, HAL, etc. So all of them worked together in one team. And this was evident though in some areas, like during the treaty negotiations, there were just 4 officers, not hierarchical, but including 2 the major advisors at that time in the embassy, where Ramesh Bhandari, I'd like to recall him, and also A.K. Damodaran, Mbadi Krishnan Damodaran, whose birth centenary also is next Tuesday. And he played a very critical role at that time. And Deepika did this in that he was very solicitous and caring, because he used to take time out in his incredibly busy schedule to visit the homes of officers. He used to enjoy bridge, but mostly, I mean, company. But he was one thing he was very clear, and is that those who can do it, can afford to stay up late and at the same time turn up for work, they would do it. Those who couldn't combine the two, he said, look, you're welcome to leave before the meal at dinners, or if you don't come also, we appreciate that, but work should not be compromised. And also, I would like to say that Deepika's spouse, whom everybody called Rani Bhabhi, irrespective of their young, old, she was a very, very strong cementing force in the embassy. Fact which people don't realize, but she did this by not only keeping an open house. The house is an open house. It was not, a somber, formal, forbidding place. It was always open. It was open and open to people from all walks of life. And it was always, you heard it was sort of alive with the, sound of conversations, animated conversations, and celebrations. Kumar just talked for wedding being facilitated, but actually he had weddings. We had a student who became a doctor, personal physician of with him was to be all. He arranged for his marriage. He was acted like a father. He arranged for that marriage, and this was typical of him. And there's so many such instances. I could keep on giving them. And his hospitality was, I said, people who were working hard. For instance, once suddenly he realized that people in what we call our cipher wing, CCB, ambassadors never went there, but he visited all of them, and he sort of said that, have you had your dinner? And they have not. So he invited them to his residence for impromptu dinner. That was what he was. So, and behind the scenes, of course, he could say that, but it was Rani Bhabhi who had to arrange it, and she did. So she was always ready for all eventualities. So I just wanted to mention some of these factors, because it's very important, because, I'll just tell you, because as I said, people from all walks of life. I remember once, there were, for instance, of course, you had people, of all, you mentioned Kashmir and what's happening there right now. There were developments, some of them. I remember Said Mir Qasim, who had come there. It was a very important time. and just for a private visit. We took him, my wife and I took him. We were interested for taking him for a day to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. But it was, uh, other things, Shairi sessions with Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Students, a lot of students were there all the time. Young students were always welcome. And just, I wanted to let you know, just last evening, association which has been formed, an alumni association of students from that time, last evening they had their second virtual meeting. They have been holding virtual meetings for decades. So that lives on. And why him? Why that time? Because that was what he was. So I wanted to bring out some of those aspects of his personality, which contributed very critically to what we were able to achieve at that time. And even for me, I just spoken long enough. I just thought I'll just conclude by giving just 2 or 3 examples of, his, and these are just examples. There are many, and many of us have had these experiences. Like, when I was going with him on one of the long after dinner walks, maybe at 10 or 11 at night. And then he noticed that, I was not equipped properly. It was cold winter. And he spontaneously took off his, typical Kashmiri Karakul cap and says, wear this. So when I was returning it back to him, he said, no, I've given it to you, except something with grace at least. And this was very typical. And the same thing with, on first anniversary, very frankly, I had almost forgotten my first wedding anniversary. And at 10 o'clock, he said, look, you're absolutely crazy. Are you suicidal or something? Just go home. And then when I was leaving, he said, you can't go like this. You can't go empty-handed. And then he handed me a beautifully packaged, amber necklace, a lovely bouquet of roses, and says, take these home, but keep it a secret from your wife, because it should not be from me, it's from you. So there are lots of these stories. I want to just give you an example. But it was, this was what he was as a man. And what he was as a man, and I just want to give you all this because of his personal warmth. What he did was, and he was completely spontaneous in what he did. One of the students was telling me last night, they were remembering that once he just, a senior dignitary had come to the embassy, and we were having problems at that time of footwear. Footwear. Because there's something wrong with the soles, they felt the Russian Soviet authority that time. He just took off his shoes, and then he showed, I think it was Minister of Foreign Trade, Patolichev, was minister for since Stalin's time for, I think, 28 years. And he showed it to him. He said, look how perfectly stitched it is. What is your problem? So he took interest in a lot of minutiae also. It was not just a political, diplomatic kind of thing. He was an outstanding trade representative of Indian business. And I can give a number of examples in that also. But the first ever long-term trade agreement was also signed during his time. I just wanted to give you some aspects of his personality, and that's what I had to say. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you, sir. Sir, could I request Ambassador Parthasati to speak?
Well, thank you so much. The fact is that Moscow was my first posting from after I left the army. And therefore, it was novel to me. And I luckily did most of my Russian language studies in India. And I needed that desperately to get promoted fast enough to become first secretary. So after having learned the language, a bit, I landed up in Moscow. And I was asked to call on the ambassador. And please believe me, I was told by him, don't come alone, bring your wife along. It was really, very, really, I think hardly knew each other. And then I must tell you, the other aspect of DP Dhar, and since Vijay is here, he was not only uh, fortunate to have such a talented father, but I think the greater things in his life would be the humane qualities of Rani Babi, his mother. And Vijay, I want to tell you, when we heard of that she had passed away, really, both Shanti and I were really, really sorry. Well, one gets to Moscow, and the first thing you have to do in those days was to buy a car. It always used to be an Opel Kadett from from Germany, and he was. So he asked, Mr. Deepudar asked me, uh, "कब जा रहे हो?" I said, "कहाँ?" He said, "भाई गाड़ी खरीदने के लिए पैदल थोड़ी आओगे यहाँ." And I said, yeah, I stalled. So he said, "क्या बात है?" I said, "सब कुछ सोच रहे हैं." He said, "पैसे की कमी है?" I said, "हाँ, पैसे की कमी है." He said, "4000 pounds we were paid, not in dollars, but in pounds sterling." And I got precisely what I wanted. And he said, "ये तुम्हारे लिए नहीं है, शांति को ले जाओ." And I really had a holiday, my first holiday visiting Germany, thanks to DP Dhar. And he left there, this camaraderie, this niceness. And when I passed my language exam really fast, he said, क्या हुआ क्या हुआ? मैंने सुना सीख के आए थे यहाँ. I said, हाँ साहब सीख के आया था यहाँ. And then we sort of moved on. Ronan had left at around that time for San Francisco, if I remember correctly. And the tensions with Bangladesh started. By which time I was doing first secretary information. Suren Arora was still there. And dealing with the press. I started really, and then ended up as the PMO spokesman. Many ways, thanks to the coaching I got from DP Dhar on press ko kaise khush rakhna hai, sort of thing. It was always basics with him. And the working then moved on and became also HOC and first secretary political, by which time we were engulfed with the Bangladesh crisis. DP Dhar returned back, and I think it was Ronan who told me about this pending treaty, which they had been negotiating at that point in time, the Indo-Soviet treaty, before he left. And then he came back with the draft for the Indo-Soviet treaty. And that was the first time since my Russian language speaking turned out to be useful. One attended some of these meetings to get a better feel of what happens at that level. But I must tell you, it's interesting because I wondered why he came at that point in time. And it turned out we had received information, when I was posted in Washington, I got to see the files. And I linked it up with DP Dhar coming. He came after the Americans literally threatened us to keep off Pakistan. And that was an interesting development in a meeting which Ambassador Jha had there. And he came and negotiated his way, went through Kosygin like he was his long lost brother. And he was the one who held the final round of negotiations on the Indo-Soviet treaty. That was it. And as I said, the reasons for his rushing back then, I learned much later when I was the political counselor in Washington about what had transpired between Jha and the Americans. So there is, one doesn't mind talking about this, it's so far ago. And then things escalated and the conflict broke out. Who lands up within 2 days of the conflict? It is DP Dhar. Again, meetings with Kosygin, meeting with Gromyko, and then he knew his way around and how to handle them. There was, I must caution you, at that time in the early days, a fairly great disinclination on the part of the Soviet Union to allow this to escalate, or for it to get out of hand and they're getting involved. But the way DP Saab played it was incredible. He dodged all the questions and irritated because he didn't wanted to know. And we went ahead and really, if you ask me, the person who really negotiated the last part of the treaty agreement, and the conflict took place. The Soviets backed us to the hilt, something I will never forget, which was a great experience. And he came back during the conflict. He came back with Field Marshal, then General Manekshaw. And they had a wide range of discussions and quite a bit of joking as somebody remarked to them that, you know, what you give, what you provide to the Indians is much more usefully utilized than what you had provided in the Middle East. So this was after the 67 Arab conflict. And the discussions, you know, were hard. And also we found the Soviets getting impatient, that it was getting too long. Again, handling by DP Dhar, and he had a tough time because, you know, they were getting tired of vetoes in the UN Security Council. And DP Dhar was the man to give them the answer about, you know, how warmly they would be welcomed whenever they visited India. He had this great capacity to turn around the conversation into something else to make people feel nice when things were getting tense. And that's something we should learn. And so he went back, and then I was the head of the Foreign Secretary's office when he came back for his second term. One kept in touch with him. I went with the Foreign Secretary as DSFSO because I was Russian speaking. I'm Director FSO later on, to Moscow, and he was there, his gracious self always. And then he came back, and you know, we never got to meet after that. But his son and heir sitting here, Vijay, is someone who I've had the opportunity of meeting. I can, as long as Rani Babi was around, certainly our family's traditions of hospitality were maintained. But I think Vijay was great. He's been a good son to a very distinguished father. Because I have to, for various reasons, visit Srinagar every now and then, even now for my university work. And the thing I want to mention finally about DP Dhar, what he was incredible about him was that to be able to relate to the foreign service. And problems later on, which I shall not reveal here. When we have a drink together, I'll do it. But I miss DP Saab when he left, because he knew how to handle us and he knew when we were feeling tense. That's a great humane quality. So I think I've given you my views of the geopolitics of the time. And just remember one thing, and I say this, and I'm not ashamed to say it even anywhere in public. The Russians have stood by us, and they will stand by us. And I miss the Soviet Union. I was moved on to the neighborhood in my later life. But I tell you, the youngsters who are there now, you will realize later on what a great privilege it is there to be there in Moscow. But more importantly, I think in my case, to have the fortune of meeting a personality by the name of DP Dhar. Thank you.
Excellent, sir. So, thank you very much. So, Ambassador Lamba, sir, could you please?
Thank you, Venkat. Well, I would like to congratulate Ambassador Venkatesh Verma for having organized this meeting, where he has got 3 of us retired ambassadors, but he has got Amitabh, Mathu, and Vijay. Amitabh is a teacher for all of us, whether he's in our age group or Ambassador. I want to congratulate you for having the future ambassadors of India with you today. And I think they have a lot to learn from a man like Professor Amitabh Mattu, like all of us have to. And since I would like him to speak, I will be very brief. I don't want to repeat. But Mr. D.P. Dhar, I have met him in Moscow. I have met him in Dhaka. I have met him in Delhi. And at each place, he has inspired me like he inspired many others. He was an iconic figure. But one thing about him is he was always young. And I'll tell you, at the age of 31, he was a member of the Indian delegation to the UNHC in 1949. And a year before that, he was Home Secretary and Deputy Home Minister of Jammu and Kashmir at the age of 30. At the age of 33, he was a member of the State Constituent Assembly, where he was for 6 years from 51 to 57. And at the age of 39, he became a member of the State Assembly for 4 years from 57 to 61. I had done this much research on him when he came as Kashmir minister to Moscow in 1968. And I had seen that what a person, because I was at that time attached to him and I spent 3 days with him. He was ambassador in Moscow and he died young at the age of 57. Everything in his life happened when he was young. You know, he had a lot to offer. When he came to Moscow, he came under very difficult circumstances. It so happened that the date coincided with the anniversary of the Tashkent agreement. And at that time, the Russians were having some problems with Pakistani. So he came at the invitation of the then RSFSR, the Russian Federation. And at London airport, they advised him not to come. He came. And he was not going to change his program at the last moment. And I went with him to St. Petersburg. And I had carried something which both of us liked, but I found he was. So then I asked him in the evening, आप बड़े अमीर लगते हैं मुझे. कहता क्यों? I said, you're spending a lot of money in buying these bottles here and I've got them free lying with me. His first comment was, हम बरखुदार की नहीं पीते whiskey. Suddenly, in the middle, he said, I went to my room and brought the bottles and then we kept them and then we had them. So we went to the collective farms. We saw other things. He was very impressed with the progress. We came back. In the evening, he told me, oh, now you've handled the bottle well. I think you can also handle a wife. You should get married. Anyone who can handle a bottle can also handle a wife. So that was his advice. I come to Delhi, and for 3 years, I am on the US desk. And I was told that I'm getting a post into Washington. Suddenly, I got a call that the foreign secretary wants to see me. I went to the foreign secretary's office and I found Mr. D.P. Dhar sitting with him. And Mr. T.N. Call said, you have been promised to Washington by some people, not by me, but today there's a double offer. Do you want to go to Dhaka or Washington? I said, sir, I have no choice. My orders for Dhaka are being cyclostyled. You see, the office was next to my office, so I knew that. So Mr. D.P. Dhar told him, Tiki, you are no longer in control. His order. So then he looked at it, he said, no, my offer stands. Is it Dhaka or Washington? I said, Dhaka. So Mr. D.P. Dhar got up and put his hand on my back. He said, good decision taken. I said, when do I go? He said, we can't tell you. The Prime Minister has to decide the date. It will be the next 4 days. But as far as US desk is concerned, you have handed over. You start preparing for Dhaka. She was waiting for Sheikh Mujib to return, which he did the next day. So this was about the 8th or 9th of January. 16th January, Mani Dixit, I accompanied him to open our mission in Dhaka. And Mr. D.P. Dhar arrives there a little later. Vijay, his wife Kiran, and her sister also were with him. And by this time, he was an iconic figure in Dhaka. So we got to know everyone through him. And so he came and she said, the first drink I'll make, then you all look after yourselves. But there was no time for another drink that evening because serious work was being done. Anyhow, that was Dhaka. I told you I'll be brief because I want to hear Vijay, Amitabh, and others. I come back to Delhi. By this time, I had proposed to my future wife, who is now my wife, but my father-in-law thought he should make some inquiries about me. So he went to his friend, his best friend of the day, Tiki Oberoi, and the two of them rang up, Mr. D.P. Dhar, we want to see you urgently. So knowing the two of them, he asked them to come at 9:30 in the evening, because at that time, all three had a common purpose. So they went there, and he said, you know the Foreign Office well. There is a boy called Sati Lamba. Can you make some inquiries about him? He has proposed to my daughter. So he told him, yes, I've made all inquiries. Go ahead and decide by this evening. It's all done. So they looked at him. You know him? He says, yes, I know him. So anyhow, so he played a role in both my personal and that was Mr. Deep. Later on, he became planning minister. And I want to say a word about the Indo-Soviet Treaty. You see, the day the Indo-Soviet Treaty was signed, I was on the US desk, and Ambassador T.N. Call briefed Ambassador Keating, and I was there to take the minute. Two important things. Firstly, Keating said, you've taken us by surprise. T.N. Call, in his usual manner, blamed the CIA for the surprise. They should have told you. It was not my job to tell you. Secondly, he said, you have made some strange, you have given some strange concessions to the Russians. He said, we give you the same. Can we sign the same agreement with you tomorrow morning? And later, Mr. A.K. Damodharan, whose birth centenary we are celebrating this year, he was my counselor in Moscow, made a very fine note, which he has given me a copy and I still retain it, that Article 9 of the treaty, we conceded much less than what even was conceded in the Soviet-Finland treaty. At that time, the Soviet-Finland treaty, Professor Amitabh Mattu would know more than anyone else about it, but the one which was posed, the Russians were supposed to have conceded the most. But Mr. D.P. had made sure that we didn't concede anything more than what Article 9 said. And as subsequent papers and discussions revealed, the Russian military, armed forces at that time, wanted a much closer relationship with us, wanted us to agree to much more. But he had only agreed to the contents of Article 9. Well, but I want to conclude with one thing, that as far as Kashmir and the Dhar family is concerned, Vijay and I continue to co-chair is session on Kashmir under the Ananta Aspen scheme, where both of us are working together. And as I many times mentioned there at the meeting, that the source of my inspiration on Kashmir is always his father, the late Mr. Durga Prasad Dhar. Thank you very much, Venkat, once again for having organized this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And of course, I recall my own tenure here in Moscow when you were ambassador in the 20 years ago. One of the highlights of my career. Could I turn now to Dr. Amitabh Mattu to speak?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Verma. Am I loud and audible?
Yes, loud and audible.
Let me also add my congratulations to you and the embassy for organizing this function, and more importantly, for refurbishing the D.P. Dhar Memorial Hall. It's only appropriate that after almost 50 years of the Indo-Soviet Treaty and 46 years after the passing away of D.P. Dhar, we still have that sense of institutional memory preserved. I remember, since we are beginning with anecdotes, visiting Moscow for the first time when you were posted here, Ambassador Verma, as the first secretary or second secretary in Moscow during the aborted coup against Gorbachev. So my memories of Moscow and your presence there go back not as far as those of those distinguished ambassadors here, but certainly fairly long time ago. The fact that you have three of our most eminent ambassadors here today is again a reflection of both your convening power, Ambassador, but also the charisma of DP Saab. I don't know Ambassador Ronan Sen as well as I do Ambassador Lamba and Ambassador Parthasathy, but it is a great tribute to DP Saab. And of course, Ambassador Parthasathy and Ambassador Lamba in particular have been deeply associated with Jammu and Kashmir as working out various ways in which we can progress further towards a settlement with Pakistan and internally. But that's for another day. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Vijay Dhar, who really has lived up in so many ways to the legacy, to the really rich legacy left by his father at a very early age. I thought what I could do, since I am here as a lonely academic, although I would want to also emphasize that Venkatesh Verma, who's a diplomat here, topped every exam that we took together. So here it's also a tribute to his cerebral thinking, which I acknowledge. But I thought what I'll do as the only formal lonely academic here, reflect on DP Saab's three milestones in his life. One was, and Ambassador Lamba has already signaled towards those three markers. One was as the student leader of Lucknow, where he became probably the only Kashmiri Pandit to become president of the Students' Union through the sheer power of his charisma. He comes back to Kashmir and joins the Quit Kashmir movement against the Maharaja as part of the National Conference, becomes a fellow traveler with BPL Bedi and others, and is also helps to draft the Naya Kashmir Manifesto. Quite appropriate that we are talking about a new Naya Kashmir Manifesto today, but the original Naya Kashmir Manifesto owes much to the thinking of D.P. Dhar and the Bedis and many others who thought of ways in which the state can intervene in making the society of Jammu and Kashmir, which was very deeply divisive then, very feudal in character, more egalitarian. And then he also establishes, once the independence comes, a link between Jammu and Kashmir and New Delhi through a personal channel with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister. Nehru's correspondence, Malik's account of Kashmir, talks about how DP Saab is the conduit between Kashmir and Delhi. And Nehru, in his correspondence with Dr. Karan Singh, for instance, keeps saying that we already have been briefed by DP, who came to see me, and he turns out to be a formidable interlocutor, standing up for India, standing up for the idea of India. And when the question of the dismissal of Sheikh Abdullah comes, he's clear that the Indian interests are paramount. So very early on, as Sati Lamba pointed out, he became probably the youngest ever at the age of 30, with Sheikh Abdullah as the Home Minister, Deputy Home Minister, virtually controlling the civil, military, security liaison within a very fragile state at that time. Then moves on to Delhi, and of course is the stage when he becomes Union Planning Minister. He's deeply influenced, as you know, with socialist thinking, and I think he brings that to bear on the social welfare schemes, on the direct attack on poverty, which were reflective in some of the plans of that period. In fact, that phase of DP Saab's life is the one which has been least studied, although there are economists like Pulin Naik and others who have reflected on DP Dhar as planning minister with his special assistant. I think he was in Moscow as well, Gopi Arora, being a part of his team at that stage, but Gopi is also passed away. And then is DP Dhar as the strategic thinker and diplomat, both as the architect of the Indo-Soviet Treaty, but also in terms of the bilateral negotiations with Pakistan. Very few people, of course, Ambassador Lamba and Ambassador Parthasathy would remember the conversation that DP Saab had in Murree with Aziz Ahmed before the Simla Agreement. He actually creates the conditions, helps to create the atmosphere in which Simla can happen. And of course, DP Saab, in popular history, is reflected as one of the Panch Pyaras, as they say, the 5 Kashmiri Brahmins who advised Mrs. Gandhi on Shimla, which is the P.N. Haksar as a principal secretary with a deep sense of history, and who is believed to have said that don't impose a Versailles kind treaty on Bhutto, let him go back with dignity and honor. To the secretary P.N. Dhar, who's really more of an economist, to T.N. Kaul, a formidable diplomat, to the chief of the External Intelligence Agency, RNW, Ramji Kaur, to DP Saab. I would say that DP Dhar in some ways encapsulated all the qualities in the 4 other Panch Pyaras. He was a strategic thinker. He knew he had an informal network of intelligence. He had the craftiness of a diplomat as well as the statesmanship to look beyond the immediate and look at the long term. So it's one of the strange ironies of history that DP Dhar today is not remembered with the same degree of robustness, with the same degree of enthusiasm and energy as he should be. Nor is there really a biography of DP Saab, which is there. I wish some of our eminent former ambassadors, diplomats, were to undertake that task. I can certainly help to provide the research assistance in terms of people who can take down the notes that they have. But I think it's something which needs to be done. But more importantly, I do want to also say that Mr. Vijay Dhar, who is going to speak now, but through the DP Dhar Memorial Trust, has ensured at least that DP Saab's great contribution in so many fields is remembered. Let me conclude by the final line that when I was an advisor to Mufti Saab, he saw, of course, DP Saab as his ultimate mentor. And the way he used to describe DP Saab was, over a drink, was that he was a kalandar. A kalandar, for those who understand the Sufi tradition, is like a person who's otherworldly, who belongs to this world, but his concerns are much more beyond the material. That DP Saab never were looked for money or power and as an end. These were instruments. And that for him, for Mufti Saab, DP Saab was the ultimate statesman. And he wished there were more people like him in India today who could carry on that sense of vision that DP had brought to bear in public life. Thank you, Ambassador Verma.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Matu. Could I now turn to Shri Vijay to speak?
I firstly am almost speechless after hearing all the stalwarts that were spoken. But however, I want to narrate 2 instances. One was when he was the president of the Lucknow University, and he invited Pandit Jawaharlal to the university at that time. And that is the closeness that they developed after that. The second story is what was told to me by Begum Sheikh Abdullah after my father passed away. She said, Sheikh Saab was collecting money for the national conference, and people will give him maybe 4 annas at that time, 8 annas, and suddenly he saw a 5 rupee note. And he was quite surprised that somebody should give him 5 rupees at that time. So he said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm so-and-so from such and such a family." He said, "Okay, you wait." And then he took him home. And that is where Begum Abdullah met him. She said, when Sheikh Saab told me that there must be there is a worker who's joined us today, and he comes from a very high family, Dhar family, please give him a cup of tea. So Begum Abdullah said that when I went down, I saw the man sitting down on the floor, and I asked him, "Will you have tea?" or kahwa? She said, I've not forgotten the voice that came out from there. And he said, I'd like a cup of kahwa, madam. Thank you. So that was him. But I must say, my first visit to Moscow, as I stepped into what was told to be Posolsta Indy, but then it was nicknamed as Gastinitsa Indy, which meant, to me, I was told, meant a guest house. Now, this was an open house, as Sati Lamba also mentioned, for everyone and anyone could walk in, stay, or eat a meal with my famous mother, who everybody called Rani Babi. And they didn't even know who was staying in the house. It so happened that one morning, Mr. Dhar walked into the living room with his cup of tea, and there were three gentlemen sitting there. And he also sat down. So one of the gentlemen said, are you also a guest of Mr. D.P. Dhar? So he very embarrassingly said, no, I am D.P. Dhar and you are my guest. That is how he was, I must say. But at the same time, my mother played a very crucial, rather, she was the strength of the embassy at that time. That's how I saw it. And Rani Babi was for everyone. Particularly, I think the students' community were free and could come in, could talk or eat with Rani Babi or go back and discuss whatever their problems was with the ambassador then. And I also remember Mr. D.P. Dhar telling us that the future is the students. And this is what we have to cultivate. Then one of my last visits was when I went to collect his belongings after he passed away. While I was wrapping and packing, suddenly I was given a message that the foreign minister has come to pay his condolences. So I went down, and the gentleman, I forget his name, who was accompanying me, he said, you know, he's broken protocol to call on you. So I was quite touched. Then when I met the foreign minister, who was very nice, he said two things. One, that if you need anything from the government, please do not hesitate. We'll have everything and anything done for you. Second, he said, DP, more than an ambassador, more than a politician, is a friend. And he will always remain a friend. Now, this was something which I broke down and I was in tears right in front of him, which was right or wrong in the protocol, I don't know. But having said these words and repeated them twice, he said, DP is a friend. And he has been a friend of the Soviet Union and he has been our friend. So please don't hesitate. If there's anything ever that you need, we'll be there. So that was the introduction to my introduction to the embassy at that time, which later on we realized that to commemorate or keep his memory alive, as Amitabh said, was to treat the students or look after the students, look after the future. And we did manage to put up a school in very difficult times in Kashmir. And I must say that the school has become one of the best schools, not only in the state, but one of the best schools in the country. And the students of this school today are in Stanford, they're in Philadelphia University, they're in New York University. Recently, one of our girls got 90% scholarship at New York University. And they all owe their, or I won't say owe is a wrong word, but they do mention that the DPS school set up, they don't say by me, they say set up by Mr. D.P. Dhar is what has brought us here. And that is something which I must say that I personally take great pride that the people of this state have given us phenomenal support. We came back here, difficult time in 92, and I could see the legacy that my father had left. And I still am under that deluge, so to say, when people come up and say, you know, we knew your father, and this is what he has done for us. And already police inspector saying that I got my job because of him. Or anybody would walk in and say, oh my God, you don't know what he has done for me. Now, this was him. And I am totally indebted to you, Ambassador Venkatesh, for having organized this as in his remembrance. I'm extremely grateful, and I want to express my family's and my gratitude for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vijayda. That was a very moving tribute paid by all who have joined us on this program. What a great man, a great life, spanning many decades and touching so many lives. I was using the opportunity that I'm based here in Moscow to look up the old files, and of course, Ambassador D.P. Dhar's tenure here was momentous in so many ways. He presented his credentials in January 1969, and in those days it was the practice that the ambassadors, the newly arrived ambassadors, during the credential ceremony, delivered a speech, what was called a credential speech. There is a copy of that speech on the files. And it is noted there in the files that the speech was delivered in Hindi. There is also an Urdu version of the speech, which I think probably was the original. It was translated into Hindi, and the ambassador spoke in Hindi during the actual credential ceremony. What is remarkable in the same file is a small note that came back from the ministry. The ministry has this anonymous ways of directing its missions abroad. And it says, dear mission, I mean, it's addressed to all missions abroad. Dear mission, we have seen the credential speech of Ambassador D.P. Dhar in Moscow. It is being considered a model credential speech, and therefore is being circulated to all missions abroad. Very simple, very powerful. So, sir, for what your father and Ambassador D.P. Dhar has done for this embassy and for the country, as a small token of our gratitude and as a small token of our remembrance, what I intend to do is to have that speech properly copied and framed, and we'll find a way of sending it across to you in Srinagar, so that it would be with you and with the foundation for others to read. Let me take this opportunity to thank everyone who have joined us today. Ambassador Ronan Sen, Ambassador Parthasarthi, Ambassador Lamba, Mr. Vijay Dhar, Dr. Mattu, and all my colleagues who have joined us this evening to remember a great man, a great life, and one of the finest ambassadors we've had, especially here in Moscow. As I said, many of the issues that he grappled with are, in a sense, timeless. And I think one of the definitions of greatness is the relevance of people in a certain timeless sense is when they deal with timeless issues. And I think Ambassador D.P. Dhar brought that together in a most humane, most fascinating, and a most unique way. So thank you all for joining us and sparing your time. We are indeed very, very privileged. This is one of those very unique meetings we've had, first in my experience, that we've had this opportunity to reach out across generations to learn from you. In fact, we are deeply inspired by what all you have done for the country. I would say Ambassador Sen was ambassador in Moscow at a very, very difficult period in our relations, and what he did to stabilize the relationship, to put the ship on an even keel, is his contribution is again timeless. It's Ambassador Lamba took it forward, and many of the projects that he was able to put in place is the same projects that we deal with today. So in a sense, that too is timeless. Ambassador Parthasarthi's association with Russia, his work experience, which is carried forward in many other areas, including his term in PMO, his tenure as XP, and a great source of support publicly in these rather different days in the public sphere. Very strong, upright, upfront support for India-Russia relations is something, again, which is timeless. Amitabh and I go back a long time. That friendship is, again, timeless in its own way, I presume. And Mr. Vijay Dhar, sir, thank you so much for gracing this meeting, and we indeed are very honored that you joined us today. So thank you all for joining us, and good luck, good health, and stay safe. Thank you. Bye bye.